Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Conflicts of Interest, Should We Be Concerned? My name is Alina Gilbert. I'll be presenting today. And as usual, prior to getting down to the nitty-gritty of things, enjoy this comic interlude while I go through some housekeeping items. So, if you've not done a webinar with us before, you should be seeing most of your screen is the PowerPoint. You should be seeing this Dilbert cartoon. And off to the left is just a little picture of the presenter. Hello, me. To the right, you will see a little icon that says chat. That is what you will go to if you have questions and you want to type them in. I will wait until the end of the presentation to go through the questions. Mostly because I want to make sure we have enough time to go through the materials. I don't want to cut us short, and then we will hopefully get to all the questions that people have, if any. If you are having any audio or visual issues as we go through this, there is a little icon on the bottom of your screen that says audio or video issues ? Press on that. It'll take you through a few steps to hopefully resolve the issue. You will get 1 CMCA credit for attending this webinar, and it will be automatically generated and it will be emailed to you. I feel it necessary to let you know that based on the way that these are generated, once you get your email with the credit, please either print it out right away or save it as a PDF, do something with it, because apparently if you don't, it disappears after a certain amount of time. And then when you go back to the email, it's gone. So please do something with it like as soon as you get that email, so it doesn't go away. If you don't see your email with your credit, please reach out to education@altitude.law, and we will try and get that fixed for you. If you didn't get it, we'll just resend it. As a reminder, we are recording the presentations now, at least these noontime ones, and it will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel within probably a day or so after the presentation. So if you have someone who really wanted to see it, they couldn't make it, please feel free to tell them there's a YouTube channel that you can access through our website to watch the recorded version of this. We just can't issue any credits for someone who's watching it as a recording versus attending live. Finally, last but not least, there will be a survey at the end as soon as I'm done. If you have time and inclination, we always ask that you fill it out, mostly because it really helps us kind of figure out what you like, what you don't like, what we can do better, what we can do different next year. I mean, we really do look at every single comment and feedback that we get. So it's really important if you can spare the few minutes to just respond and give us your feedback. All right. So why don't we go ahead and get started on the actual presentation materials now, which you should have all received via email. Again, if you haven't seen it or you haven't received it, feel free to email that education email address I just gave you and ask us to resend it to you. We're certainly happy to do that. All right. So conflicts in general. You know, why did we decide to do this class? I looked through our prior classes and I didn't really see that we had done a class just on conflicts of interest. And it seems to be coming up a lot right now. I'm hearing it all the time from people. Well, that's a conflict, or this is a conflict, and that's a conflict. And I'm just hearing it all the time. And I find that when people say that, they say it because it seems like the right thing to say, but they don't truly understand what a conflict of interest is. And so hopefully the goal of today's program is to talk about conflicts of interest so we all have a much more clear understanding of what it means, whether it's lawful, what can be done, and is it really something that can get people in trouble. So in general, conflicts of interest fall under the general category of ethics, right? It all has to do with whether or not you're being ethical. And ethics is the acceptable social/industry norms and standards. It's also compliance with one's fiduciary duties. That's a very big, broad topic. But I want to focus on 3 specific types of conflicts of interest. I want to talk about the statutory conflict of interest. I want to talk about an actual conflict of interest that may not be statutory. And then I want to talk about perceived conflicts of interest. So we're going to go and talk about each of these 3 types of conflicts. All right. So the first one is the statutory conflict, and the statutory language is found in our Nonprofit Act, and this is a cut and paste of what the statute says as far as how it defines a conflict of interest. It says a contract, and I know you can read this yourself, but essentially it's saying it is a contract, transaction, or other financial relationship between what? The nonprofit corporation and a director, between the nonprofit corporation and someone related to the director, or the nonprofit corporation and another entity in which the director is a director or has some sort of financial interest. This is the only statutory definition for conflict of interest. So if you've got homeowners or board members accusing other board members or whatnot of conflicts of interest, keep in mind this is the only statutory definition that applies to HOAs. So what does it exactly mean? It means there's really 3 kinds that was just described, 3 kinds of conflict. So, excuse me. And one is where you have a board member, a current board member, entering into some sort of a financial, contractual transaction or some sort of a relationship with his or her association. That's one. The next one is you have a party related to a director who's entering into this type of a transaction with the association. Now, there is language in the statute that defines what a party related to a director means. And I tried to simplify it because, nothing in the statute is easy or clear. But basically, it says that a spouse, a sibling, a descendant, an ancestor, or a spouse or descendant of a sibling, an estate or trust in which the director has a beneficial interest. I mean, these are all parties related to the director. I found it interesting that parents of the director aren't on here, grandparents aren't on here. So that's interesting, but whatever. So that's a party related to the director. So if I don't own, but my brother owns a landscaping business and that landscaping business is bidding to do work in my community and I'm on the board, that's a conflict of interest for me, okay, under the statute. The last type of conflict of interest is the association enters into what? A transaction or relationship with another entity in which the board member has a financial interest or serves as an officer or director on that board. So what does that mean? Well, it means they probably own the company or they serve on the board of directors, board of governors, or whatnot for that particular company, corporation. So those are the only 3 situations in which the Nonprofit Act is going to say, yes, there is a conflict of interest here. Okay. So, is it unlawful? It's actually not unlawful. There are 3 options that the statute provides that allows these conflicting transactions to continue, or to make them more valid, so to speak. So one of them is, and this is what we typically see happening, is you have the conflicted director, they disclose the conflict to the board, or the board already has knowledge of it somehow. And then a majority of the disinterested directors approve it. So the disinterested directors are basically the directors that have no skin in the game, right? They're the ones who it's not a conflict for them. They don't have monetary gains to be made by this. So a majority of them have to approve the transaction. If that happens, it's fine, it's lawful, it continues. Next one is there can be disclosure to the homeowners, or the homeowners already know about this and the homeowners approve. I've never seen that actually come to fruition because honestly, most communities are, bigger than just a few people, and board members are not inclined to go to all these homeowners and say, hey, guess what? I have a conflict. Will you approve me doing this? I just don't see it happening, but it is an option under the statute. And then there's this last option. Transaction is fair to the association. This is a sucky option. That's my legal opinion. It's sucky. Why is it sucky? I think it promotes unethical behavior because, here's an example. I, as a board member, own a landscaping company, and I have seen bids that other landscapers have provided to the association. So I can submit my bid. I can underbid all of them, right? Because I've seen these other bids. And I'm not going to tell the board that this is my company. Well, the board ends up approving this contract, this bid that I submitted. And then after the fact, I say, haha, I gotcha. I'm an owner of this landscaping company, or I sit on the board of directors of this landscaping company. So the only question at that point is that transaction fair to the association? Well, if you have basically the association's paying me less than it would be paying other contractors, and I am performing the same services, my quality is generally as good as these other companies, it would be very difficult to argue that the transaction is not fair to the association. But at the same time, I just got away with not having to disclose something that I really should have disclosed, right? Because it is not right, it is unethical to not be fully honest with the board and with your community. And so I have just basically kept the truth from people, worked it to my advantage so I can make some money off it, and there's nothing that the association can do to cancel or terminate this agreement because it is quote unquote fair to the association. So for this reason, I'm not a fan of this particular exception when it comes to the conflicts of interest statute. It is just setting people up to do the wrong thing and to let them get away with it. So that's just my personal opinion. I know not everyone feels that way. So let's talk about some takeaways here. Now, one thing I want to point out that isn't actually in here is this only applies to directors, okay? If you notice, there was no language in the Nonprofit Act making this apply to committee members, to managers, to anyone else who has a relationship with the association, to the attorneys, to the CPAs, to the vendors. I mean, it only applies with board members. It only applies when there's some sort of a financial transaction or a financial benefit to the director. So ultimately, when you hear homeowners or others saying, well, that's a conflict of interest, the answer, if there's no financial interest in this, whatever situation is, if no one's making money off it, the answer is it's really not a conflict of interest by definition, right? By the legal definition of what it is and what it means in the Nonprofit Act, it does not fall under the statutory conflict of interest. So it's important to remember that this is a really important factor when you're thinking about whether something's a conflict. So also important to understand they're not unlawful. Even without disclosure, they can still be enforceable and fully within the confines of the law. And finally, the director, the interested director, there's nothing that says they can't vote. So you can't force them from basically not voting. You can't force them to leave the room while the board is discussing their specific bid or whatnot. You know, it might be the right thing to do, but the statute says you need a majority of disinterested directors to approve it. So basically, even if your interested board member votes, it's not going to count. right? Because we only care about the disinterested votes. And if they want to be there while the board is discussing this issue, even though it might be very uncomfortable for the other board members, they can be there because nothing says that we can exclude them. Okay. All right, let's take a cute little funny break, and then we're going to go on and talk about actual conflicts. Yes, these are all based on ethics, and Dilbert is perfect for that. All right, actual conflicts of interest. So a little bit different here, right? So what is an actual conflict? Which by actual, what I'm saying is it's not statutory. It's not something that the statute defines, because we already talked about the statutory conflicts. So the dictionary definition of a conflict of interest is a conflict between the private interests and the official responsibilities of a person in a position of trust. Okay, so when we think about it, well, our board members are in a position of trust, right? They are elected to act on behalf of the corporation to preserve, protect, and enhance property values, to manage the money of the association, which comes from all the other homeowners. If that's not a position of trust, I don't know what is. And so certainly it is easy to look at, you know, something that the board or a specific board member does and say, this doesn't feel right, therefore it's a conflict of interest. It may or may not actually be a conflict of interest. So I also want to point out that the Nonprofit Act in another section has a very specific, what we call standards of conduct. That's what the statute is called, standards of conduct. And it says that directors must act in good faith, with the care of an ordinary, prudent person, and in the best interests of the association. Okay? And sometimes when someone says there's a conflict, what they're really trying to say is, well, no, because you're really just breaching your fiduciary duty or your standard of conduct as a board member. It doesn't fall under the statutory definition of a conflict, but maybe it falls into this dictionary definition, or maybe it just is wrong ethically and it's in violation of these various standards of conduct. So what do we mean by these? Oh, and these also don't just apply to directors, they also apply to officers, which typically, you know, so your president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, and typically, of course, you know, your officers are also board members, but that is not always the case. So it applies to both directors and officers. So to act in good faith essentially means you're putting the interests of the community ahead of your own personal interests. That's what it means. So I am not going to make decisions as a board member. I'm not going to vote as a board member for something that benefits me personally, but does not benefit the community as a whole. That is acting in good faith. And if I don't act in good faith, then it's not necessarily a conflict of interest, but it could be a breach of my obligation as a board member. It could be a breach of my fiduciary duty, and I could still be exposed to liability that way, even though it may not be a true conflict of interest. You also have to act with the care of an ordinary, prudent person. What does that mean? Well, it kind of means you have to be like this reasonable person, and you have to do what a reasonable person under the same circumstances would do. And with it, it carries the duty to also be informed when making decisions on behalf of the association. Then there's in the best interests of the association, which again means it's what's best for the community as a whole versus me personally as a board member versus my neighbors versus my friends in the community. We got to look at what's best for the whole and not just a faction of homeowners, right? So we see this, for example, sometimes a board wants to do something and then you have these objectors, right? They come to the meeting, they send letters, they get attorneys sometimes, and they're very loud and they're very insistent. And listening to them, they make it sound like, oh, this is the whole community. But if you look at the numbers, they usually represent less than 5%, if that, of the homeowners. But they're so loud and they're so obnoxious, and the boards a lot of times just don't want to deal with them, and so they're like, fine, we'll just do this so they can stop complaining and get off our back and stop sending things out to other homeowners. Well, is that really in the best interests of the association? Those are the types of questions that you really need to ask yourself with these when you get into situations like this, because doing something just to make your life easier as a board member is not acting in the best interest of the association, and it may not be acting in good faith either. So those are all things to kind of keep in mind. So again, take this, the title of this section, Actual Conflicts of Interest, take it with a grain of salt, because what we may be talking about are like general conflicts of interest just by the dictionary definition, or we may be talking about situations that maybe are more of a breach of your duty as a board member. Okay, but they blend, and people use this, use these terms interchangeably. So just a few examples. So a board member has his unit repaired before anyone else's, and while there are other units in the community that perhaps have a higher need for repairs, so maybe the board member insists on their unit being repaired first, and it's mostly aesthetic stuff, while there are structural issues with other units or more dangerous conditions, and as a result, this board member's unit is still done first. So that is something that is, well, it does fall under the definition of a conflict of interest, because let's go back and see what that is, right? It's between the private interests and the official responsibilities. So that's exactly what this is. My private interest is to have my unit repaired as soon as possible. But my responsibility to the community as a board member is to act in the best interest of the community as a whole, which means we're going to start with the most kind of egregious situations that need to be fixed, so we're not endangering anybody, right? So that is a conflict. It could also be a breach of my fiduciary duty. Either way, it doesn't feel right and it doesn't sit right. So this is a good example. I've had boards, and this isn't on here, but I had a recent situation where I had a board that community desperately needed a big repair. It was like an elevator repair, and it was going to go out, it wasn't safe to use anymore. And the board knew that the right thing to do was going to be to impose a special assessment. That was the only way they were going to pay for it. But then we had some folks on the board who were like, well, I can't afford that. I don't want to impose this against myself. And they actually didn't impose it for that reason. So what they did was put the community in danger and their homeowners in danger, because they didn't want to pay personally special assessment. That is bad, right? That is definitely a conflict of interest based on the definition we read. It is a breach of your fiduciary duty because you're not putting the interests of the association above your own, right? Board does not follow advice of an expert recommendation because it doesn't like it. And sometimes boards don't follow expert recommendations because they don't want to spend the money. A lot of times it just all comes back to money. So again, same type of analysis. What would be in the best interests of the association, right? As opposed to what is in the best interest of this specific board member or a group of board members or our friends in the community. Director refuses to enforce governing documents against owners he or she likes. I've seen this before. I have seen boards that will not send violation letters and will not send delinquency letters to other board members. They're not comfortable doing it. They don't want to do it. Whatever the reason is, they don't do it. Well, guess what? That is a breach of your fiduciary duty, and it does represent a conflict of interest in the sense of the definition in the dictionary. Okay, so those are some examples of things that we've seen, and I suspect you've seen this as well as a whole bunch of other examples that are very questionable at the least. So let's talk about some takeaways with respect to these types of conflicts. So actual conflicts, at least for directors, they may still fall under the Nonprofit Act language with respect to their duties as board members, and they may still constitute a violation of your obligations as a board member, whether or not it's truly, a conflict of interest. It could still fall under, a breach of your fiduciary obligations. Actual conflicts will likely be violations of the standards of conduct, like we just talked about. And actual conflicts can expose directors and boards to liability. And I always want to kind of throw this in there because it's important that all boards understand this and managers know this, so you can tell your boards. But when it comes to insurance and when individual board members get sued, it's not if, it's usually when, you would submit a claim to the insurance carrier on behalf of the association who is supposed to pay for your defense. Well, there are a lot of different exclusions in these types of D&O policies. And one of them is if you do something willful with malice, or it's wrong and you're doing it anyway, those types of situations, obviously criminal, wanton, those types of things, generally excluded from coverage. So you have to be very careful as a board member when you are doing things, because if you are breaching your fiduciary duties, if you're acting outside the scope of what you can do or should be doing against expert advice, guess what? You're putting yourself in that category of, if somebody sues me, insurance may reject the claim and not pay for my defense. Then what do I do? Right? So these are things that I always want to point out because it's just not worth the risk, right? So then the question really is, well, what do we do? Well, how do we help our boards? How do we avoid these things from happening? And the best thing that I think we can do is to educate our boards, educate, obviously community managers get education so that you can understand what your roles and responsibilities are, so you can understand where you could get in trouble and what to do and what not to do. Usually it's common sense. Sometimes maybe it's not, but for the most part, and to also educate everyone on how insurance works and how, if you want to be covered, you got to act in good faith, and you've got to act like a reasonable, prudent person. Okay? So those are the things that to keep in mind with respect to these other types of conflicts of interests or breaches of your duties as a board member. Another funny moment. All right. Okay, so the next, probably what we tend to run in more often than not, is perceived conflicts of interest, which are basically perceptions that board members, directors, it could be anyone, it could be committee members, managers, right? We all fall under this. The perception could be about anyone that we are favoring, is that a real word? Favoring, thank you. Favoring our own interests over the interests of the community. And it doesn't matter what the reality is. I always want to stress that. This is the perception. And this is a perceived conflict of interest, regardless of what is actually going on. And I know a lot of folks say, well, we don't care because it's not a real conflict and it doesn't matter because they're just stupid. And well, intelligence may very well be a factor, but let's talk about why these do actually matter and all the harm they could bring to a community. First, let's maybe talk about a few examples. And these are real examples. These are things that I've encountered over the years, and I think they're interesting. So one is you have a wife who's on the board, and then her husband is on the chair of the architectural committee. I have seen this more than once, and it doesn't sit well with a lot of homeowners, and they say, oh, that's a conflict. Well, guess what? We know it's not a statutory conflict because it doesn't involve any money or any kind of monetary transaction. So we know it doesn't fall under that. Is it a breach of someone's duty? Well, I don't know. I mean, is it in good faith? Can a wife still act in the best interests of the community while her husband's the chair of the ARC? I mean, I don't see why not. So I don't think it's an automatic like breach of your obligation as a board member. It's not necessarily a conflict between your official responsibilities and your personal interests. I mean, the husband and wife may not even talk about this stuff, you know? So this is a great example of a perceived conflict. Now, could the wife and the husband be doing something wrong? Could they be talking about things they really shouldn't be talking about? Sure. Could they be conspiring? Sure. But on its face, this is not a conflict or a breach of duty. So this typically falls within a perceived conflict. Reimbursing board members for unit repairs. So this is a little different than what we talked about with the actual conflicts. This isn't necessarily a board member saying, do my unit first at the detriment of others. This is a situation that I've seen where, you know, like any other homeowner, a board member made repairs due to whatever, and they were entitled to reimbursement under the governing documents, and they submitted for it, and the association paid it. And the only reason it was perceived as a conflict is because this person just happens to be on the board. If it was any other homeowner who wasn't on the board, this would not have been an issue. But because it was a board member, it was automatically perceived by others when they found out that this was a conflict. Because, well, look, they got money. They got money because they're on the board. Except that that's not why they got the money, right? They got the money because they were being reimbursed for something they did that the association was responsible for, or something like that. The next one's pretty interesting too. So a board member is employed by the association's current management company. That has happened. Now, a lot of times people say, well, wait a minute, Alina, that is a conflict because that is a direct financial transaction. And I say, well, hold on a second. What is this board member's role in the management company? Because remember, the only time it's going to be a conflict is if they have an ownership interest in the company or they're on the board of directors for it. If this person is an employee of the management company, then they're getting their paycheck regardless of whether this association uses this management company or a different management company. So there's no direct tie to anything, and it doesn't fall under the conflict of interest provision we talked about in the Nonprofit Act. Is this a breach of their duty? I mean, I don't think so. I don't think so. Why would it be a breach of their duty just because they happen to work for the management company? Now, if they're going to the management company and they're saying, yeah, this board hates you and they're getting ready to fire you, so you better do X, Y, and Z, that could be a breach of that duty. But outside of that, it wouldn't be a conflict of interest. So again, this is a situation where homeowners look at it and they're like, well, that's not right. It just doesn't sit right. It doesn't feel right to them. But when you dissect it into little pieces, you realize that it really doesn't fall under any kind of a real conflict or a breach of duty. All right. Oh, I have one that wasn't on here that actually I was talking to another attorney in my office before I came in here to do this class, and she gave me an example, and I thought it was wonderful that she just recently encountered. She said, hey, I have a situation where there's a board recall meeting, and the people, you know, the owners who are upset and trying to recall the board, they're saying that the board can't vote on it because it's a conflict of interest for them to vote on their own recall. So again, let's take that apart, and well, it's not a financial thing, so no. Board members are also owners, so they've got as much of a vote as every other homeowner does. So is it a conflict? I don't think so. It's not a breach of their duty either. They can vote for whoever they want on the board. So they can vote for themselves. They can vote for someone else. They can vote against their own removal. Not a conflict, but I guess I can sort of see the logic there. A couple other ones is using vendors that the directors like or have a relationship with. This comes up also with management. And I remember way back when, if you can think that far back, when we had the manager licensing and everybody had to take the test, and we were preparing for that. And one of the things we had to prepare on was ethics. And I always cracked the joke of, isn't it funny? You guys are being taught ethics by an attorney, ha ha ha. And people would laugh. I still think it's hilarious. But ultimately, this comes across all the time, and I always hear management companies getting accused of this. Well, you're just picking, recommending companies that you like, or where you like their owners or whatever. And my answer is, yeah, and isn't that what you're supposed to do? Don't you want to work with companies that you've done business with before, that have been good to you, that have done a good job, that have been responsive, that work well with you? Why wouldn't we want to do that, is my question. How is that a conflict in any way, shape, or form? To me, that's more of, we are complying with our duties. So whether you're a board getting accused of this or management company, I really, this one always gets me. It's like, of course we want someone we have a relationship with. That's the best kind of, contract, is someone, people like doing business with people they like. How about this one? Board member has dinner with a community manager. I've seen this kind of go awry as well. Now, in this particular case, what happened was the board member and the community manager, they were actually friends outside of, business. So they went out to dinner as friends. They did not use association funds or anything like that. But someone got wind of it, that they were out to dinner, and all of a sudden it became this whole big, huge thing of, how dare you, how dare you go to dinner, just you, one board member and the manager. What are you guys talking about? What are you doing? Instant suspicion, which kind of really, I want to tie into this last point, which is lots of working sessions by boards and secret meetings. Now, are they really secret meetings? I doubt it. But here's generally how it works, is when owners don't know everything, right? Which kind of impossible for them to know everything. But if they don't know everything and there's missing pieces, they're filling in those blanks themselves. They're not giving anyone the benefit of the doubt. They're filling them in, and they're filling them in a negative way. That is absolutely what's going to happen. And I actually did some research on this. I know it was beyond the legal piece, but all humans have what scientists call is a negativity bias. In other words, we're all drawn to the negative. That's just how we are. We're flawed specimens, but we're drawn to the negative. And so, which is why, we always want to slow down and look at the accidents on the highway when we're driving by. That's why we get the bottlenecks, because everyone wants to slow down and take a look, but we're drawn to it for whatever reason. And so if I'm filling in the blanks, I'm just going to talk for myself. I am not going to fill them in favorably. I'm going to assume that people are in cahoots and they're talking about something inappropriate and they're planning something awful. And that's exactly what the homeowners do, or at least the vast majority of them do. So that's why these types of things are perceived as conflicts of interest, as really bad things, whether they are or aren't in real life. It's because we don't know what's happening, during these meetings or during that dinner. We don't know what you're talking about, so we're just going to assume it's something really inappropriate and really bad. Okay? Without fail. Are perceived conflicts unlawful? Well, as we've just seen from these examples we went over, they're not necessarily unlawful, are they? And they could still fall under like the unethical or questionable behavior type categories. Although honestly, I think most of the time the perceived conflicts are not conflicts at all and are not examples of wrongdoing. Most of the time they're just not. But it can make a director or board member or whoever else look really bad regardless of what the reality is. It doesn't matter because my perception is my reality, right? So I don't really care what you're doing. All I care about is how I see it and how it appears to me. So again, why do we care? Well, we just talked about why we care. Because perception matters. And it can erode trust between homeowners and board members, between board members and managers, homeowners and managers, homeowners and legal counsel. I mean, you just name it. I mean, almost anyone who falls into this mix is going to be susceptible to it. And once that trust is eroded, you probably already know that it is extremely difficult to get it back, if at all possible, right? Because now we're going to have homeowners doing what? They're going to start writing letters to other homeowners, right? They're going to start petitioning. They're going to start putting social media posts about how absolutely awful their board is. The board's stealing money. The board's involved in all this self-dealing. The manager is also horrible. Everyone's horrible, and they're all in on it. Legal counsel's incompetent. And I mean, I suspect most of you have seen this kind of stuff before. And so you know how it can get out of hand very, very quickly. It spirals. And so that's why we care, is because, you know, ideally nobody wants to be in that kind of a situation. So what can we do? And maybe this is really the page we should have started with. What can we do? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is everyone should have a conflict of interest policy. It is one of the 9 required policies. Make sure you have it. Now, under the statute, under Kiowa, there's only certain things that need to go in there. And those things are really just related to the statutory conflict of interest that we first talked about. However, you can add to it. You can add and you can address other types of conflicts and fiduciary duty type situations. So your policy can talk about, you know, perception of conflict. Your policy can talk about, you know, what we don't want to do as a board. You know, these, I mean, I've seen all sorts of different types of verbiage and policies that boards have added. Some of it good, some of it maybe a little overkill, but the point is you should definitely have a policy in place. Keep in mind, just because a board member breaches your conflict of interest policy, it doesn't mean we can kick them off the board. It just means they're in violation, and now we can say, don't do that, or you should resign. But ultimately, the board can't force another board member off unless that person was appointed by the board. Okay? All right, be transparent and communicate. That is, these days, I think it's becoming more and more difficult because we're seeing a lot of angry people out there. We're seeing a lot of scary things. People are threatening their board members. I mean, there's just all sorts of mean people out there, people with guns, people, you know, I mean, it's a scary world out there. And so most folks are not necessarily inclined to be like advertising things to their homeowners saying, oh, well, today we met in private to talk about blah, or today we're going to fix this board member's unit because blah. And, you know, I'm not necessarily suggesting that much, but being transparent is, if you're having a working session, then maybe you send a follow-up to your homeowner saying the board met to discuss blah, 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 blah. You know, and, you know, you can say that this was not a formal meeting, no decisions were made, but this is what was discussed. And perhaps that then fills in those blanks for your homeowners who don't know what's going on, and maybe that'll make them feel a little bit better, and maybe they won't be as suspicious. Recusal, certainly, I mean, this is especially with the statutory conflicts, I would agree that it's probably, it looks best if the interested director recuses themselves, if we're going to vote on whether or not to pay for repairs to a board member's unit, I think it would be ideal for that board member not to be there during the discussion and to not vote. Not a requirement, though. So I think it just looks better and it builds more trust. Consider alternatives. All right, so what else is there? Like, what, for example, what could we have done differently to not have raised this suspicion? Was there a different way of doing it? Could we have maybe had less secret meetings? Could we have discussed this more in an open board meeting, right? Could we have been more communicative with respect to the interior unit repairs, especially as it impacts board members? Could we have sent some communication out explaining why, you know, board members can vote at their recall meetings? I mean, was there something else we could have done? And ultimately, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but you should always consider whether there's an alternative way to do things that perhaps does not raise as many eyebrows. Again, education, right? I talked about it earlier. Board education, owner education, absolutely imperative for folks to understand what their roles are, what their responsibilities are, what they can do, what they can't do. And the more informed your homeowners are, the more likely you are to cut off that negativity and that perceived conflict, you know, at least in their eyes. The more they know, you know, the better constituents they can be. And then ultimately, sometimes you do nothing because there's nothing you can do. Have you ever worked with a board and you have these owners in the community that no matter, it doesn't matter what you say, doesn't matter what you do, they're going to complain and they're going to complain and they're going to complain and they're going to basically say you're doing it wrong no matter what. Unless you resign from the board, they're just not going to be happy, right? I have seen this. I know you have seen this. And so sometimes there's really nothing you can do with certain situations, but I would recommend that be kind of like a last resort after you think about all these other options. And I'm sure you probably have some other options. If this was a live class, I'd have people raise their hands and say, hey, what kind of things have you tried that have worked for you? And it's good because then the managers can hear each other and hear examples and hear about other ideas and thoughts. Unfortunately, you know, with the webinars, we can't do that. Certainly you can type in a comment if you want in the chat box and I will read them. But it's always good to share insights and your own experiences. But with that in mind, let's end this on another Dilbert cartoon, which has to do with conflicts, of course. And we are now going to go we do have a few questions. So let's get through these. I think we have plenty of time for all of them. Let's see if I can get my mouse to work. Oh, here we go. All right, sorry. Let's do this. What about friends with directors on the board? Is this not a conflict of interest? Well, first of all, who's friends with the directors on the board? No, I don't see it as a conflict of interest of someone being friends with a director, whether it's a vendor or a manager or someone else. Again, we kind of, you know, talked about that earlier, and that is people like doing business with people they like, and so why is it bad for people to have a good relationship when they're working together? Now, if you're talking about someone other than, you know, like a vendor or a manager, feel free to send another note and then I can address that specifically. But saying that the board member's friends with someone, to me, is not a conflict, and it's usually a positive thing, actually. What if a board member has a contractor do their work at their house? A contractor that has contracted to do work on HOA property. That's a good question. Thank you for putting that out there. That is a great example also, I think, of a perceived type of conflict because it is, well, it's not a monetary benefit to the board member. They're paying to get the work done, and they're not involved in a transaction with the association. So this is a transaction between a board member and a contractor. Now remember, contractors do this all the time. They do work for associations, but they'll contract with individual homeowners to perform work in their individual units. And this is absolutely fine. There's not a conflict there. You just have to make sure it's kept separate from association business. And what the contractor does with individual owners is between those two, and the association should have absolutely no involvement in that whatsoever. Why is it referred to as a statutory conflict of interest if it's not unlawful? Because it's defined in the statute as being a conflict of interest, so that's what I mean. It is statutory in the sense that it falls under all the parameters that the statute gives it to call it a conflict of interest. Let's see. How responsible is the manager if they note a conflict to the board? Example, use of a company a board member owns and the board does nothing. Do we make a note of this in writing? Good question. So as the manager, sure, you can make a note of it, but it seems to me like in this particular example, you have put the board on notice, so the board now knows that this board member owns this company, and if a majority of the disinterested directors still approve it, at that point, it seems that they have complied with the statutory requirement. So I don't know that they've really done anything wrong per se, other than perhaps it wasn't a contract that was fair to the association, but if the board approved, there's nothing that says it has to be fair. Could be a breach of their fiduciary obligation, though, to act in the best interests of the association. Let's see. Spouse owns a company providing a bid to the HOA for service. Right. So that falls exactly under the definition of a conflict of interest under the Nonprofit Act, because remember, a spouse that has an interest in a company that is entering into some sort of transaction with the association does constitute a conflict of interest, which means what? It gets disclosed, it gets approved, or it's fair. So you mentioned that parents were not mentioned in the statute. Wouldn't they fall under ancestor along with grandparents and great-grandparents? Yeah, maybe. That's a good question. Maybe they are ancestors. You know what? I'm going to say they are. There you go. We just included the parents. Thank you. Love it. Sorry. Let's see. What if a homeowner wants to bid on an HOA project? Would that be a conflict? If it's a homeowner who's not a board member, there is absolutely no conflict there at all because they don't have any duty to the association. They're just a homeowner, so they can do whatever they want. Although it would be good to know that the person who's bidding does own a home in this community. I mean, I think that's important for the board to know, but it's not going to be a conflict. What is the best way to handle a member of the board having a long-term relationship, i.e. dating, with a member of a management team? There is currently no policy from the association management company. Okay, so you've got a board member who's dating someone in the management company. Now my question is, are they dating the actual manager who's managing this community, or are they just dating someone from the management company? If they're just dating someone from the management company, in my opinion, that's the same as, you know, you have a board member who works for the management company. It's not really a conflict. It doesn't really have any financial implications to either party. And I don't really think it's a breach of their fiduciary obligation, because I don't see how that is not in the best interest, or I don't see how that hurts the association. So on its face, I would say that is not going to be a conflict of interest. If you have a board member who's dating the actual manager, even that doesn't really, it's not a statutory conflict, but I think it might fall under that kind of icky situation where, is it a breach of your fiduciary duty? Maybe not, but it's icky, and you are for sure going to get some political pushback on that kind of a relationship. So I'm not trying to be judgmental. I'm just saying that's something that could raise eyebrows. Sorry, let me see where I'm at. Is there a legal problem with the board soliciting / approving a contract or bid without the management company's involvement or approval? Well, it doesn't violate any laws. It's more about kind of like the practical piece of you're paying your management company to do a service for you and you're not using them. Also, I mean, but that's up to the board. I think if you're excluding your management company, you should at least let it know that you are, you should let them know that you're doing this, so there's not like double efforts. And so at least the management company is aware of what the board is trying to do so that they can do their job and help. What about a manager dating a contractor? Is that a conflict to be disclosed when bidding on projects? Again, under the plain definition, this is not a conflict, right? Because our conflicts of interest only apply to board members, and this is a manager dating a contractor. Now, if I'm the manager and my boyfriend is bidding a property, I would disclose it, because if it comes back, if I don't disclose it and later people find out I'm dating the contractor, I think it's going to just look bad, and it's going to look like I was dishonest, even though I just withheld the information. But I think it's going to look like I was dishonest, and I think that's going to cut a big wedge in the relationship between the board and the manager, as opposed to if you just tell them. I mean, to me, if you're asking the question of should I tell someone, it means that there's something in the back of your head saying I probably should tell someone, which means you probably should tell someone, or you just don't have them bid that property. But it's not a true conflict, and it's not a breach of a fiduciary duty. But I think it goes a lot towards trust between the manager and the board. Let's see. Oh, so we're going back to the question about a board member having a long-term relationship with the on-site assistant manager. So again, I think this is not like a real conflict in the sense of how the statute defines it, but it's definitely something that people are going to raise their eyebrows at, and it might just be better for all involved for that to be disclosed and out in the open. Now, could it still, cause problems in the community? Absolutely, it could. And you know what? If it does, it does. But I always say better to like just be honest and open, and because again, once you lose the trust, you lose the trust, and it's probably not coming back. Oh, okay. So last one. This is a clarification. We talked about the spouse owns a company providing a bid. So in this case, the clarification is it's a manager's spouse, not a board member's spouse. So again, so this is a question of, do I as a manager disclose this? Again, doesn't fall under the statutory conflict, but if I'm on the board, I would want to know. And if I wasn't told this up front, I'm going to think that you are not being honest with me as my community manager, even though it may not be any of my business, but I'm going to perceive it as you're not being honest. I don't trust you. I may need a different manager. And I suspect a lot of boards might treat it that way. But again, this is, I'm certainly not trying to be the queen of ethics here. I am just trying to kind of tell you whether it's whether it falls under the legal definition. And if it does, then you know what you have to do. If it doesn't, now it's kind of this moral thing of, do I disclose it? I mean, for me personally, I would disclose it, but it's totally, I think, up to each individual person. And we're at 1 o'clock, you guys. Thank you so much for joining, and please do the survey if you have time. Thanks so much. See you next time.